Welcome to the channel Stories of Slavery. I'm sure that today's story, William Robinson's story, will touch your heart deeply. So relax, stay quiet for a moment, and listen carefully. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you're listening from. Your participation helps keep these stories alive. Let's begin. The sun hadn't fully risen when William Robinson followed his mother through the cotton fields of Thornfield Plantation on that March morning in 1879. He was 12 years old, barefoot, wearing patched trousers and a shirt that had been mended so many times the original fabric was barely visible. The dew soaked through his clothes as he walked, and the air carried the smell of wet earth mixed with wildflowers that grew along the property edges. It was Thursday, harvest day, when the overseers walked nervous and the black workers kept their heads down and their mouths shut. Sarah Robinson, William's mother, moved through the rows with practiced efficiency despite her exhaustion. At 32, she looked 50. Her hands were calloused, her shoulders permanently bent from years of carrying impossible loads, her eyes always watchful for danger. She had taught her son one simple rule that had kept them both alive. Never look white folks in the eye, never talk back, never react. Just survive. But that morning, survival would demand something different. Thomas Thornfield Jr. had been drinking since the previous night. Everyone on the plantation knew it. The whiskey smell preceded him by 10 yards, and his eyes were red-rimmed and wild when he emerged from the main house just after dawn. At 23, he was mean, when sober and worse when drunk, and he'd spent the night nursing grievances both real and imagined. When he saw Sarah Robinson working her row, something in his alcohol-soaked brain decided she was moving too slowly, taking too many breaks, showing insufficient deference to her betters. His voice cut through the morning silence like a whip crack, hurling words at Sarah that made other workers vanish into the cotton rows like ghosts. William watched his mother's face go still and blank, watched her body assume that terrible posture of submission that meant danger was close. Thomas Jr. grabbed Sarah's arm and spun her around, scattering cotton from her basket across the ground. His fingers dug into her chin, forcing her face upward, and the words that came from his mouth made William's stomach clench with a fear deeper than anything he'd known. The other workers had disappeared completely. That was the rule. You became invisible when white folks got violent, because witnessing meant testifying, and testifying meant dying. But William couldn't become invisible. His feet moved before his mind could stop them, and words came out of his mouth that he'd swallowed for 12 years. He told Thomas Jr. to leave his mother alone, and the shock on the white man's face would have been funny if the situation weren't so deadly. Sarah tried to intervene, throwing herself between her son and Thomas Jr., pleading and apologizing and trying to diffuse the situation through the practiced submission that had kept her alive this long. But Thomas Jr. shoved her hard, and Sarah fell backward with a cry of pain that shattered something fundamental inside William's chest. He charged without thinking, without planning, his small body slamming into Thomas Jr. with all the force his underfed frame could generate. It wasn't much force. William was small for 12, weak from inadequate food and hard labor, but Thomas Jr. was drunk and off balance and surprised. He staggered backward, arms windmilling, boot heel catching on a half-buried rock. The fall seemed to happen in slow motion, the white man's body tilting, then dropping, then his head meeting stone with a sound like a watermelon hitting wood. Wet and final and irreversible. For 3 seconds, the world stopped breathing. Thomas Thornfield Jr. lay motionless in the dirt, blood pooling beneath his head and spreading into the South Carolina soil like an accusation. Then Sarah was grabbing William's shoulders, her voice a desperate whisper telling him to run now and never stop, and never look back and never return. William tried to argue, tried to explain it was an accident, tried to say he couldn't leave her. But Sarah was crying and pushing him toward the tree line, telling him they would kill him, that the law didn't care about accidents when a black boy put hands on a white man, that his only chance was to disappear. She screamed then, long and wailing, a sound that would echo in William's head for years to come. She was screaming to cover his footsteps, screaming to give him time, screaming because her son was gone and she would never see him again. William ran into the forest and didn't look back. And behind him, his mother's grief filled the morning air like smoke. The forest swallowed him whole. He had been to the tree line before but never ventured deep, never gone beyond the safe edges where plantation children sometimes played. Now the forest was his only refuge, and he ran until his lungs burned and his legs gave out, and he collapsed against a massive oak tree and vomited bile onto the moss. When the retching stopped, he pressed his forehead against rough bark and cried like he'd never cried before, great heaving sobs that left him empty and shaking. Thomas Jr.'s face flashed in his mind on repeat, that moment of surprise, the sound of skull meeting stone. The blood. The words repeated like a broken prayer. I killed a man. I killed a white man. I killed someone. It didn't matter that it was an accident. Didn't matter that he was protecting his mother. In South Carolina in 1879, a black boy who caused a white man's death faced only one outcome, and that outcome involved a rope and a tree and a satisfied crowd. As darkness fell on that first night, William climbed into the hollow at the base of the oak tree and pulled dried leaves over himself for warmth. It wasn't enough. The March night was cold, and he shivered violently, teeth chattering, body curled tight. Sleep came in fragments, broken by fear and cold. Every sound jerked him awake. Was that footsteps, dogs, a search party with torches and guns? But no one came. The forest kept its own counsel, and William Robinson spent his first night as a fugitive shivering in the dark, whispering prayers to a God he wasn't sure was listening anymore. By the third day, hunger had become a living thing, gnawing at his stomach and making his thoughts fuzzy and slow. He had found water, a clear stream about a mile from his oak tree, but water alone wasn't enough. His body was consuming itself, and desperation drove him to remember things his Uncle Moses had shown him years ago about fishing. William's first attempts at making fish traps were disasters. But by the third day, he'd woven something that held together, positioned it in a narrow section of stream, and waited with the patience of someone who had no other options. The single small fish in his trap that evening was barely the length of his hand, but it was alive, and it was food. His hands shook as he grabbed it, feeling its heartbeat against his palm, feeling the terrible weight of taking another life, even as hunger screamed in his belly. He killed it quickly with a rock to its head, and cried while he did it, and that night he made fire for the first time. 3 hours of striking rocks together until sparks finally caught in dry grass and pine needles, his hands raw and bleeding by the time flame grew enough to feed with twigs and branches. The fish was burnt outside and raw inside, and it was the best thing he'd ever tasted. William ate slowly between sobs, whispering thanks to the fire and the fish and God and whatever force had kept him alive for 3 days. He was learning that survival demanded killing, that staying alive meant taking life, and the parallel to what he'd done to Thomas Jr. wasn't lost on him. Maybe he was a killer now. Maybe that's what the forest was teaching him to be. The days blurred together as William learned the language of his new world. Bird calls that meant dawn was coming. The difference between wind rustling leaves and animals moving through underbrush. Which plants were edible and which would kill him. He learned that second lesson the hard way, spending an entire day vomiting and feverish from eating the wrong berries. Certain he was dying alone. But he survived, and now he knew about wild onions and cattail roots and dandelion greens and wood sorrel. He moved his camp regularly, some instinct telling him to avoid patterns even though he'd heard no sounds of pursuit. His hands developed calluses over the blisters from making fire and weaving traps and climbing trees for birds' eggs. His bare feet toughened until he could walk over pine needles and rough bark without flinching. He was becoming something else, something wild. Something that belonged more to the forest than to the human world he'd fled. At night, alone in whatever shelter he'd constructed, William talked to his mother. He told her about the fish he'd caught, the deer he'd seen, the way he was learning to survive. And always, he apologized. The guilt sat in his chest like a stone that never dissolved, never lightened, never gave him peace. He had killed a man, and even out here in the wilderness, that fact colored everything he did. When he caught fish, he thought about ending Thomas Jr.'s life. When he built fires, he imagined flames consuming a warning cross in his mother's yard. When he slept, he dreamed of ropes and trees and crowds. The forest was both prison and sanctuary. He was alive, but he was alone with his guilt, and some days he wasn't sure which was worse, dying on Thornfield land or surviving out here with nothing but his own thoughts for company. Around day 40, William noticed tracks near his camp. Large paw prints, too big for any dog, unmistakably wolf. The realization sent ice through his veins, because wolves meant danger. Wolves hunted in packs. Wolves could kill a boy alone in the forest. For 3 days he saw only tracks. Then on the 4th day, he saw the wolf itself, drinking from the stream about 30 yards away. A massive grey creature, lean and powerful, with yellow eyes that caught the morning light. William froze, every muscle locked, remembering that running triggered chase instinct. The wolf lifted its head, water dripping from its muzzle, and those yellow eyes found William and held. For a long moment they stared at each other, boy and beast, predator and prey, or maybe both predators, both killers trying to survive. Then the wolf turned and melted back into the forest, and William's legs gave out. He sat down hard on the stream bank, with his heart hammering so loud he could hear it in his ears. The wolf didn't return immediately, but a week later William was gutting a rabbit when he felt eyes on him. He turned slowly to find the wolf sitting at the edge of camp, maybe 20 feet away, just watching. William's hands were bloody from the rabbit, and the wolf's nostrils flared at the scent of fresh kill. In that moment, William understood something fundamental. The wolf was a killer too, killing to eat, killing to survive, just like him. He cut off a piece of rabbit and tossed it toward the wolf. The animal flinched but didn't run, approaching the meat cautiously before grabbing it and retreating to the tree line. Those yellow eyes stayed on William the entire time, and William heard himself speaking to the creature, telling it that they were the same now. Both killers who lived in the forest, both doing what they had to do to stay alive. The wolf's ears twitched at his voice, but it didn't flee, and when it finally disappeared into the shadows, William felt something shift inside him. The wolf hadn't attacked. The wolf had accepted what was offered and left him in peace. Over the following weeks, the wolf became a regular presence. William started calling him Shadow, because that's what he was. A shadow at the edge of firelight, a shadow in the forest, a shadow of violence that mirrored William's own. Shadow would appear at dusk, accept whatever food William offered, and sit beyond the fire circle while William talked. William told Shadow everything, about his mother, about that terrible morning, about the guilt that never left, about the fear that someday someone would find him and drag him back to face justice that wasn't justice at all. Shadow never answered, but those yellow eyes watched, and somehow that was enough. On day 103, William woke to find Shadow sleeping at the entrance to his lean-to, not inside but close enough to share warmth on a cold night. William stared at the sleeping wolf, at the rise and fall of its ribcage, at the twitching paws as it dreamed, and thought that maybe killing didn't make you evil if you only did it to survive. It was the first time since Thomas Jr.'s death that William felt something like forgiveness. Not complete, not total, but a crack in the wall of guilt he'd built around himself. By midsummer, William had built a better shelter with 4 walls of woven branches packed with mud and moss, a thatched roof, a proper fire pit with a smoke hole. Inside, he kept his possessions: fire stones, fish traps, a bone knife carved from deer leg, a wooden bowl burned and carved from oak, useful plants hanging from rafters to dry. He started marking time on the wall, 1 line for each day, arranging them in groups of 7. The lines accumulated steadily, a physical record of survival, a countdown to something he couldn't quite name. Shadow brought him a rabbit on day 201, dropping the fresh kill at William's feet with an expression that seemed almost proud. William stared at the gift, throat tightening, because it meant something profound. This wild creature, this predator, this killer, had decided William was worth feeding. They were packed now, both of them alone, both of them doing what they had to do, both of them surviving against the odds. They ate together that night by the fire, and for the first time since that terrible morning, William didn't feel completely alone. Autumn came with changing colors and real cold that made those first March nights seem mild in comparison. Frost coated the leaves, streams turned ice cold, animals hibernated or migrated. William adapted by weaving a rough cloak from plant fibers and rabbit fur stitched with sinew, lining his shelter with dried grass and leaves for insulation, stockpiling massive piles of firewood. Food became scarce, fish were sluggish, plants had died back, birds had flown south. Shadow disappeared for 3 weeks, and William spent those weeks in constant anxiety, wondering if the wolf had died, or left for better hunting grounds, or simply decided William wasn't worth visiting anymore. When Shadow returned on day 308, thinner and limping on one front paw, William cried actual tears. He prepared dried fish he'd been saving and set it out, watching the wolf eat ravenously before collapsing near the fire. For the first time ever, Shadow let William approach close enough to examine the injured paw. A thorn was embedded deep in the pad, and William used his bone knife, heated in fire, to clean it, to carefully extract the thorn. Shadow whimpered but didn't snap, didn't pull away, just endured. Afterward, William wrapped the paw with soft moss and cloth stripped from his own shirt, and Shadow licked William's hand once, a quick brush of rough tongue against skin. In 5 months of interaction, Shadow had never touched him on purpose. This was trust. This was pack. William carved the 365th line into his shelter wall and sat back, staring at the complete year. 365 days since he'd pushed Thomas Thornfield Jr., since he'd heard that terrible sound, since his mother had told him to run. 1 year of surviving alone, of learning to fish and hunt and trap, of learning which plants healed and which killed, of learning to make fire and shelter and tools, of learning to live with guilt that never quite faded. 1 year with Shadow, the wolf who had stayed through the worst of winter, hunting when William couldn't, sharing kills, sharing warmth on the coldest nights. Shadow sat beside him now, close enough that William could feel warmth radiating from grey fur. William closed his eyes and tried to picture his mother's face, but the details were fading. The exact shade of her eyes, the sound of her laugh, the way her hands moved when she worked. The realization that he was forgetting her brought fresh tears, but he couldn't risk going back to check on her. If he went back, they would hang him, and if they hanged him, who did that help? His mother had told him to live, to run and live. So that's what he was doing. He reached out slowly and settled his hand on Shadow's head, fingers tangling in coarse fur. Shadow didn't pull away, and they sat together in silence as the sun set, boy and wolf, survivors both, watching the forest darken around them. Tomorrow would be day 366, the beginning of year 2. William Robinson had survived 1 year. He had 635 more days to go before he reached 1,000. The second winter was harder than the first, with longer cold periods, deeper snow, scarcer game. William lost weight he couldn't afford to lose during weeks when fish traps froze solid and snares caught nothing. But he survived, and when snow melted and first green shoots pushed through the forest floor, William felt something he hadn't felt in months: hope. He was 14 now, though he'd lost track of his actual birthday, taller than before, lean and hard from constant physical demands, hands completely calloused, feet tough as leather. His hair had grown long and wild, hanging past his shoulders in matted locks. He looked like a wild thing. He felt like one. Shadow had changed too, grown into a massive adult wolf with thick coat and powerful build. The animal still hunted alone sometimes, disappearing for days, but always returned to William's camp, to the fire, to the food they shared. On day 450, William made a decision. He needed to explore beyond his familiar territory, to see what lay further west, away from the plantation, deeper into wild country. Maybe there were better hunting grounds. Maybe there were other people, not Thornfield people, but strangers who didn't know his story. Maybe there was a town where he could start over, claim to be an orphan, find work. But he was afraid. Afraid of people, afraid of questions he couldn't answer, afraid that guilt was written across his face in letters everyone could read. Still, he couldn't stay in the forest forever. He told Shadow about his plan, and they headed west together. William navigated by sun and stars, reading the land the way his ancestors must have read the African savanna centuries ago. He moved with confidence now, no longer the frightened boy stumbling through underbrush. The forest changed as they traveled, less pine, more hardwood, different birds and plants. On the fourth day they found a real river, wide and swift and deep, and William stood on the bank, staring at water that represented a boundary. This was farther than he'd ever been from his shelter, new territory, unknown and potentially dangerous. Shadow sniffed the air and started following the riverbank south, so William followed, trusting the wolf's instincts. After hours of walking, William smelled cookfire smoke. His heart raced as they crept forward carefully until he saw it through the trees. A small cabin with chimney puffing smoke, a cleared area with garden plot and chicken coop. Someone lived here. An old white-haired man emerged from the cabin, moving slowly as he scattered feed for chickens. He looked harmless, looked kind, but William's first instinct was to run, to retreat back into the forest and never approach human habitation again. He forced himself to watch instead, to observe, to wonder if maybe he could talk to this old man and ask for help. But what would he say? How could he explain? He couldn't, so he backed away slowly, careful not to snap branches, Shadow following silent as moonlight. They made camp a mile upriver, and William lay awake thinking about that cabin, about human civilization, about everything he'd left behind, and everything he was becoming. On day 520, William found a cave that changed everything. Not a small cave, but a deep one, cool and dry, with multiple chambers extending back into hillside. It was perfect. Better than his shelter, safer, warmer in winter and cooler in summer, protected from wind and rain, big enough to stand in, with natural chimney effect that would draw smoke from fire out through cracks in rock above. Shadow padded in cautiously, sniffing every corner, then sat down in the main chamber and looked at William as if to say this would do. Over the next month, William moved his camp completely. He carried everything from old shelter to the cave, built a proper fire pit using river stones, created sleeping platforms from wood and moss, even diverted a small spring so fresh water trickled into a natural basin inside the cave mouth. It felt like building a home, not just surviving but actually living. Shadow claimed one of the back chambers as a den, dragging in grass and leaves to make a bed, still wild and independent, but treating the cave as a base. On day 543, William carved a new calendar on the cave wall, all 543 lines painstakingly reproduced. Then he added drawings using charred wood from the fire, his mother's face, trying to capture her features before they faded completely from memory, shadow, fish and deer and forest. And one more thing, a gravestone with initials T.T.J. William whispered to the drawing that he was sorry, that Thomas Jr. had been a bad man but didn't deserve to die, that it was an accident, that he was just trying to protect his mama. It was the first time he'd truly acknowledged not just guilt, but genuine regret. Thomas Thornfield Jr. had been cruel and drunk and violent, but he'd also been somebody's son, somebody's brother, a human being whose life William had ended. The weight crushed down on William's shoulders, and he wept, deep, wrenching sobs that echoed through the cave. Shadow pressed against him, solid and warm, offering the only comfort the wolf knew how to give. William looked at the calendar on the wall through his tears. 543 days, almost a year and a half. He asked the empty cave how long he had to stay out here before he'd paid for what he'd done, how long before he could go home. No answer came, but he knew anyway. He'd decided on 1,000 days when he first started counting, some arbitrary number that felt like enough penance, enough time for the world to forget, enough distance from that terrible morning. He still had 457 days to go. As spring turned to summer in his second year, William's survival skills had evolved beyond mere subsistence into something approaching mastery. He could read weather in the clouds, predict animal movements by subtle signs, find water where the ground looked dry, identify hundreds of plants by sight and smell and taste. His traps caught fish and rabbits with reliable efficiency. His fire starting had become so quick and easy he barely thought about it. He could track prey through forest that would have seemed impenetrable a year ago. Shadow had become less a pet than a partner, a fellow hunter who coordinated with William in ways that seemed almost supernatural. When William checked his fish traps, Shadow would hunt the banks for water birds. When William set snares in the underbrush, Shadow would drive small game toward them. They had developed a language of glances and gestures, a vocabulary of survival that transcended species. William no longer felt alone in the forest. He felt like he belonged here, like this wild place had accepted him and made him part of its rhythms. But acceptance by the forest didn't erase his longing for human connection. Late at night, when the fire burned low and Shadow dozed in the back chamber, William would lie on his sleeping platform and think about his mother. Was she still alive? Had the Thornfield family taken revenge on her for William's actions? Did she think about him, wonder if he was alive or dead? The questions haunted him, and with each passing day, the urge to find out grew stronger. By day 700, William had made another decision. When he reached 1,000 days, when his self-imposed penance was complete, he would leave the forest. He would go back, not to the plantation but to the areas around it, and he would search for his mother. It was dangerous, possibly suicidal, but the alternative was staying in the forest forever, never knowing, never seeing her face again, never having the chance to tell her he was sorry and he loved her and he'd survived. The third winter came, and William was ready for it this time. He had stockpiled more food than he needed. Dried fish and smoked meat and rendered fat, baskets of nuts and roots stored in the cool back chambers of the cave. He had thick furs from deer and rabbits, a proper winter cloak that kept him warm even on the coldest nights. He and Shadow weathered the snow and ice together, comfortable in their cave, well-fed and safe. Spring of his third year brought a restlessness William couldn't shake. He was 15 now, nearly 16. No longer a boy, but not quite a man either. Something in between, something the forest had shaped into its own image. He started ranging farther from the cave on his explorations, always with Shadow at his side, mapping the wilderness in his mind and learning its secrets. He found abandoned homesteads that nature was reclaiming, stone foundations where cabins had once stood, rusted tools half buried in leaves. Each discovery was a reminder that he wasn't the first person to try living out here, and he wondered about those others. Had they succeeded? Failed? Returned to civilization? Or died in the wilderness? He found other caves, other rivers, other territories. He found places where wolves had denned before. Shadow wasn't the only one of his kind in these woods. He found bear tracks and panther scat, and places where wild boars had rooted through the ground. The forest was full of life, full of danger, full of beauty that took his breath away. On clear nights, he would climb to high rocks and look at the stars and feel simultaneously tiny and enormous, insignificant and eternal. On day 892, William carved another drawing on the cave wall. Not his mother or Shadow this time, but himself. He drew the boy he'd been, small, frightened, running into the forest with nothing but the clothes on his back. And next to it he drew the person he'd become, taller, stronger, wilder, with long hair and tattered clothes and eyes that had seen too much. The contrast was stark, almost shocking. The forest had transformed him, and he didn't know if that transformation was blessing or curse. Shadow had grey in his muzzle now. The wolf was getting old, moving a bit slower, sleeping more. The realization that Shadow wouldn't live forever hit William hard. This wolf had saved his life in ways that went beyond physical survival. Shadow had given him companionship when loneliness threatened to destroy him, had taught him that killers could still be good, had shown him that loyalty and love could exist even in the wild. When Shadow was gone, William would be truly alone again. The thought was unbearable, but it also clarified something important. Life was short. His mother's life, Shadow's life, his own life, all of it temporary, all of it fragile. He couldn't waste years hiding in the forest when he had the chance to see his mother again. The penance he'd imposed on himself was arbitrary anyway. 1,000 days didn't erase what he'd done. No amount of time could bring Thomas Jr. back or make the killing right. All he could do was live the best life he could with the guilt he carried, and that meant reconnecting with the person who mattered most. As day 1,000 approached, William began preparing for departure. He couldn't take much. Travel would be on foot, through territory he didn't know, toward a destination he could only hope to find. He made a pack from deer hide, filled it with dried food and fire-starting materials and his bone knife. He made a decision about Shadow, too. The wolf was too old for a long journey, too recognizable as dangerous. William would go alone. On the morning of day 999, William sat with Shadow outside the cave and explained what he was going to do. The wolf's yellow eyes watched him steadily, and William wondered how much the animal understood. He scratched Shadow behind the ears, feeling the coarseness of aging fur, the knobs of bone beneath skin that used to be covered with more muscle. That night, William couldn't sleep. He lay on his sleeping platform, listening to Shadow's breathing from the back chamber, thinking about everything that had happened since that terrible morning. He had survived 1,000 days in the wilderness. He had learned to hunt and fish and trap. He had learned to make fire and shelter and tools. He had learned to live with guilt and loneliness and fear. He had befriended a wolf and found peace in solitude and discovered strength he didn't know he possessed. But he had also paid a price. He had lost 3 years of his life. He had missed seeing his mother, missed knowing if she was safe, missed being part of the human world. He had become something wild and strange, something that didn't quite fit in civilization anymore. When he left this cave tomorrow, he would be stepping into a world that had moved on without him. A world where he was either forgotten or still wanted for murder. On the morning of day 1,000, William Robinson carved the final line on his cave wall. 1,000 lines, arranged in groups of 7, covering a large section of rock. 3 years, 1,000 days. His penance was complete. He packed his deer hide bag, checked his supplies one last time, and turned to Shadow. The wolf sat at the cave entrance, watching him with those ancient yellow eyes. William knelt and wrapped his arms around Shadow's neck, burying his face in grey fur, breathing in the wild animal smell. When he finally let go and stood, tears were streaming down his face. Shadow whined softly, a sound William had rarely heard from the normally stoic wolf. William couldn't speak. There were no words for this goodbye, no way to express what Shadow had meant to him. He simply touched the wolf's head one last time, then turned and walked away from the cave without looking back. He walked east, toward the rising sun, toward Jasper County, toward his mother. Behind him from the cave entrance, Shadow howled, a long, mournful sound that echoed through the forest and cut straight through William's heart. He didn't turn around. Turning around would break him completely. Instead, he kept walking, kept moving forward, kept putting one foot in front of the other, carrying 3 years of survival and guilt and loneliness and hope with every step. The forest that had been his prison and sanctuary slowly thinned around him. The dense wilderness gave way to lighter woods, then to scattered trees, then to the edge of farmland. William stood at the tree line, looking out at cultivated fields and distant buildings, at the human world he'd left behind. He looked nothing like the boy who had fled into the forest. His hair was wild and long, his clothes were animal hides and tattered cloth. His face was weathered and scarred, his eyes held shadows that hadn't been there before. He took a deep breath and stepped out of the forest into the open land. The sun felt different here, hotter and more exposed. The air smelled different, less green, more dust and smoke. He felt simultaneously vulnerable and invisible. Certain everyone would notice him, and equally certain no one would recognize the wild creature he'd become, as the boy who killed Thomas Thornfield Jr. 3 years ago. William walked through empty fields toward the first signs of habitation. He would be careful, would stay away from the main plantation, would ask questions of people who seemed safe. He would find his mother. He had survived 1,000 days in the wilderness for this moment, for the chance to see her face again, to tell her he was alive, to ask for her forgiveness, even though she'd given it 3 years ago when she told him to run. The journey was just beginning. Day 1001 stretched ahead of him, unknown and terrifying and full of possibility. William Robinson, who had been a boy when he entered the forest, and was something else entirely now, walked toward his uncertain future, with his heart pounding, and his mother's name on his lips. Whatever came next, whatever dangers or joys or sorrows awaited, he would face them the way the forest had taught him, with courage and adaptability and the will to survive no matter what the world threw at him. His penance was complete. Now came the rest of his life. William moved through the edges of civilization like a ghost, staying to the tree lines and abandoned paths, watching from distances that kept him safe. The first farmhouse he approached belonged to an elderly black couple who were working a small tobacco plot at the edge of their property. He waited until evening, until the man had gone inside and only the woman remained, hanging laundry in the fading light. Something about her reminded him of his mother, the way she moved, the careful efficiency of her hands, the weariness in her shoulders. He stepped out of the shadows and she saw him immediately, her body going rigid with fear. William raised his hands slowly, palms out, trying to look harmless even though he knew what he must look like. A wild thing with matted hair and animal skins, barely human anymore. The woman's hand moved toward the laundry basket, where William could see the handle of a knife. He spoke quickly, his voice rough from years of disuse except for talking to Shadow, asking if she knew Sarah Robinson from Thornfield Plantation. The woman's expression shifted from fear to something more complex, suspicion mixed with pity mixed with recognition. She asked why he wanted to know, and William told her the truth, or part of it. He said Sarah was his mother, that he'd been gone a long time, that he needed to find her. The woman studied him for a long moment, her eyes taking in every detail of his appearance, perhaps trying to reconcile this wild creature with the memory of a plantation boy from 3 years ago. Finally, she told him that Sarah Robinson didn't work at Thornfield anymore. After what happened with the Thornfield boy, and here the woman's voice became careful, neutral, revealing nothing of her own opinions, Sarah had been sent away. The Thornfield family hadn't wanted her around, hadn't wanted the reminder. Some said she'd been sold to another plantation further south. Others said she'd run away. Still others whispered that old man Thornfield had given her papers and told her to disappear before his son's friends decided to take revenge. William's heart clenched at the uncertainty. His mother could be anywhere, could be enslaved or free, alive or dead. He asked if the woman knew anything else, anything at all, but she shook her head and told him he needed to leave before her husband came out and saw him. She said it wasn't safe for him here, that people still remembered what happened to Thomas Jr., that there were men who would happily collect a reward for information about the boy who killed him. William thanked her and melted back into the darkness, carrying his first real information in 3 years and the crushing weight of not knowing where his mother was. Over the following days, William made his way carefully through the countryside surrounding Jasper County, staying hidden during daylight hours and moving at night, approaching isolated houses and asking careful questions of anyone who would talk to him. Most people were afraid of him. Some threatened him. A few showed pity and gave him scraps of food or information. He learned that Thornfield Plantation had suffered in the years since Thomas Jr.'s death. Crops had failed, workers had fled, creditors had come calling. Old man Thornfield had died the previous winter, and the plantation was being parceled off and sold. The great house stood empty, windows broken, weeds growing through the porch boards. He learned that after the incident, after William had disappeared into the forest, there had been a search party. They'd hunted for him with dogs and guns for 3 days before giving up, deciding he'd either died in the wilderness or gotten far enough away that he wasn't worth pursuing. They'd questioned Sarah Robinson for hours, but she'd sworn she didn't know where he'd gone, that he'd just run, and she hadn't seen which direction. Some of the men had wanted to punish her anyway, but old man Thornfield had intervened. Maybe out of guilt, maybe out of grief, maybe just out of exhaustion. He'd given Sarah her freedom papers and enough money to leave the county. That much seemed certain. What wasn't certain was where she'd gone. William tracked down a preacher who had served the black community around Thornfield, an ancient man who lived in a tiny cabin and survived on charity from former slaves who remembered his kindness. The preacher's eyesight was failing, but he remembered Sarah Robinson clearly. He told William that Sarah had come to him before she left, asking him to pray for her son, asking him to light candles and remember a boy who might be dead but who she hoped was alive somewhere. She'd told the preacher she was heading west, toward Columbia, where she had a sister who'd bought her own freedom years before. The preacher gave William a name, Esther Clark, and an approximate location, a neighborhood on the outskirts of Columbia where free black folks had established a small community. It was the best lead William had found, and he took it gratefully, leaving the preacher with the last of his dried meat as payment for the information. Columbia was 40 miles away, a journey that would take days on foot, through territory William didn't know. But he'd survived 1,000 days in the wilderness. He could survive a 40-mile walk. The journey was harder than he'd expected. The forest had made him strong, but hadn't prepared him for traveling through farmland and small towns where people could see him. He had to steal clothes from a washing line because his animal skins attracted too much attention. The stolen shirt and trousers were too small and didn't fit right, but they made him look more human, less like something that had crawled out of the woods. He stole food too, taking what he could from gardens and smokehouses, hating himself for the theft, but unable to survive otherwise. He had no money, no legal existence, nothing but his determination to find his mother. He slept in barns and under bridges, always moving before dawn, always aware that he was a fugitive in a land where justice was swift and brutal for people who looked like him. Twice he narrowly avoided slave catchers who were patrolling roads and checking travelers. Once he hid in a cornfield for an entire day while a search party passed by looking for runaways. The experience reminded him viscerally that he was still wanted, still hunted, still just one unlucky encounter away from a noose. Colombia was bigger than any town William had ever seen. The streets were crowded and loud, full of people and horses and wagons, full of commerce and chaos. William felt overwhelmed by the noise and the smells and the sheer number of human beings packed into one place. After 3 years in the forest, with only shadow for company, the density of humanity was almost unbearable. He kept to the edges of the city, asking careful questions, following directions toward the neighborhood the preacher had described. The community of free black folks lived in a collection of small houses and cabins built on land that nobody else wanted. Too swampy, too far from the main roads, too close to the river that flooded every spring. But it was theirs, or at least they occupied it without interference, and that made it valuable beyond measure. William walked through the neighborhood at dusk, looking at faces, searching for any sign of his mother or this aunt he'd never met. An old woman sitting on a porch called out to him, asking what his business was. William told her he was looking for Esther Clark, and the woman's expression shifted to something wary. She asked why, and William said it was a family matter, that he'd come a long way, that it was important. The woman studied him with shrewd eyes that saw more than William was comfortable revealing. Then she pointed to a cabin at the end of the row, small but well-maintained, with flowers growing in boxes under the windows. William's heart hammered as he approached. He knocked on the door softly, not trusting his voice, not sure what he would say when someone answered. The door opened to reveal a woman in her 40s, tall and strong, with features that reminded William of his mother. She looked at him with confusion at first, then with growing recognition, then with something like shock. She said his name as a question, "William?" And he nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Esther Clark, his mother's sister, stepped back and let him in, closing the door quickly behind him as if afraid someone might see. Inside the cabin was warm and clean, with a fire in the hearth and the smell of cooking food. Esther stared at him for a long moment, taking in his appearance, clearly trying to reconcile whatever image she had of him with the reality standing in her home. Then she asked the question he'd been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. Did his mama know he was alive? William shook his head, and Esther's face crumpled with emotion. She told him to sit, to wait, that she had something to tell him. William sat on a wooden bench by the fire while Esther moved around the cabin, her hands restless, touching things without purpose, clearly struggling with whatever she needed to say. Finally, she sat across from him and told him that his mother had indeed come to Colombia, had lived with Esther for almost 2 years, working as a washerwoman and saving every penny she could. Sarah had talked about William constantly, wondering if he was alive, if he'd survived, if he would ever come back. She'd lived with hope and guilt in equal measure, hope that her son was safe and guilt that she'd sent him away. Esther's voice broke when she told William what happened next. 8 months ago, Sarah had gotten sick. It started as a cough, the kind that came and went with the seasons, but it had gotten worse instead of better. She'd kept working through the fever and the pain, kept pushing herself because she couldn't afford to stop, couldn't afford a doctor, couldn't afford anything but survival. By the time Esther convinced her to rest, the sickness had gone too deep. Sarah Robinson had died 6 months ago, in the winter, in Esther's cabin, with her sister holding her hand and her last words being about William. She'd asked Esther to tell him if he ever came back, that she loved him, and she was proud of him, and the thing he'd done, pushing that white boy, had been right and good and brave, even if the world said otherwise. William felt something inside him crack and shatter. He'd survived 1,000 days in the wilderness. He'd endured cold and hunger and loneliness and guilt. He'd befriended a wolf and learned to live like an animal and traveled 40 miles through dangerous territory. And he was too late. 6 months too late. His mother had died believing he might be alive, but never knowing for certain, never seeing his face again, never hearing him say he was sorry and he loved her, and he'd survived because of her sacrifice. The sound that came out of William was barely human. It was grief and rage and despair all mixed together, the accumulation of 3 years of suppressed emotion finally breaking free. Esther moved to hold him, but he couldn't accept comfort, couldn't accept anything except the terrible knowledge that he'd failed. He'd waited too long. He'd imposed his arbitrary penance of 1,000 days, and it had cost him everything that mattered. If he'd come back after 1 year, after 2 years, after any amount of time less than 3 years, he might have seen her alive. He might have held her hand. He might have said goodbye. He don't know how long he sat there, don't know when the wailing stopped and the tears dried, and the numbness set in. Esther stayed with him through all of it, not speaking, just present, bearing witness to his grief the way family should. When William finally had enough control to talk, he asked where his mother was buried. Esther told him there was a cemetery for the black community about a mile from the cabin, that Sarah was there under a simple wooden marker with her name carved into it. William stood immediately, needing to go there, needing to see it, needing something tangible to make it real. Esther took him there in the darkness, carrying a lantern to light their way. The cemetery was small and crowded, markers packed close together, some wooden and some stone, and some just piles of rocks. Esther led him to a spot near the back, under an oak tree, where a weathered wooden cross bore the carved words, Sarah Robinson, 1847-1879. William fell to his knees in front of the grave, his hands touching earth that covered his mother's body, his mind unable to fully comprehend that she was below him, 6 feet down, gone forever. He talked to her the way he'd talked to her every night in the forest, telling her about his 3 years in the wilderness, about Shadow and the cave and the fish traps and the survival. He told her about the guilt he'd carried, about the penance he'd imposed on himself, about the 1,000 days he'd counted thinking it would somehow make things right. He told her he was sorry for taking so long, sorry for not coming sooner, sorry for pushing Thomas Jr. even though she'd told him it was right and brave. He told her he loved her and missed her and didn't know how to live in a world where she didn't exist. Esther waited at a respectful distance while William poured out his grief to the earth. When he finally stood hours later, his voice was hoarse and his body was shaking with exhaustion. Esther took him back to her cabin and made him eat and gave him a blanket and let him sleep by the fire. He slept for 14 hours straight, the first real sleep he'd had since leaving the cave, and when he woke, Esther was there with food and patience. Over the following days, Esther told William everything she knew about his mother's last years. Sarah had found peace in Colombia or something like it. She'd made friends in the free black community, had attended church services and social gatherings, had started to build a life that wasn't defined by slavery and fear. She'd never forgotten William, had talked about him constantly, but she'd also found moments of happiness. She'd laughed sometimes, she'd sung in the church choir. She'd helped other runaways who came through Colombia looking for safe passage north. She'd lived, not just survived, and that meant something. Esther also told William that his mother had saved money for him, just in case. A small amount hidden in a jar, kept for the day when William might return and need help starting a new life. It wasn't much, a few dollars in coins and bills, but it represented years of sacrifice, pennies saved from washing other people's clothes, Money that could have bought Sarah medicine or better food or small comforts. Instead, she'd saved it for a son she hadn't seen in years, who she wasn't certain was alive, who might never come back. William took the money with shaking hands and promised Esther he would use it wisely, would build something with it, would honor his mother's sacrifice by making a life worth living. But he didn't know what that life looked like. He was 16 years old with no family except an aunt he barely knew, no education beyond basic reading his mother had taught him, no legal status, no prospects. He was still technically a fugitive wanted for killing Thomas Thornfield Jr., even though the plantation had collapsed and nobody seemed to be actively looking for him anymore. Esther suggested he could stay in Colombia, could find work in the community, could build a life here where people wouldn't ask too many questions about his past. But William felt restless and displaced, unable to settle in one place after 3 years of constant movement in the forest. The city was too loud, too crowded, too full of people and rules and structures he didn't understand anymore. He'd become something wild, and the wilderness was calling him back. He spent 3 weeks in Colombia, visiting his mother's grave every day, helping Esther with chores around her cabin, trying to figure out who he was and what he wanted. The black community was welcoming but also insular, protective of their own, suspicious of strangers who might bring trouble. William didn't blame them. He was trouble, always would be, carrying the weight of a dead white man and 3 years of isolation that had changed him fundamentally. One evening, sitting on Esther's porch and watching the sun set over the swampy land, William made his decision. He couldn't stay in Colombia. He couldn't go back to Jasper County. He couldn't pretend to be something he wasn't. The forest had claimed him, had made him into something that didn't fit in the human world anymore, and maybe that was okay. Maybe that was what he was supposed to be. He told Esther he was leaving, and she didn't argue or try to convince him otherwise. She just asked where he would go, and William told her the truth. Back to the wilderness, back to the cave, back to Shadow if the wolf was still alive. He would live there, would build a real life in the forest, would survive the way he'd learned to survive. Maybe someday he'd be ready to rejoin civilization. Maybe not. But for now, the wilderness was where he belonged. Esther gave him supplies, proper tools, a real knife, a pot for cooking, a blanket, some dried food to get him started. She also gave him something else, something more precious, a small leather-bound journal and a pencil. She told him to write down his story, to record what had happened, to leave something behind that proved he'd existed and survived and mattered. William promised he would, though he wasn't sure he could put any of this into words. Before he left, he visited his mother's grave one final time. He'd carved a new marker during his weeks in Colombia, using the woodworking skills the forest had taught him. It was simple but well made, with Sarah Robinson's name and dates carved deeply enough to last for years. He planted wildflowers around the grave, the kind his mother had loved, seeds he'd gathered from the edges of town. He told her goodbye, told her he loved her, told her he was sorry one more time, even though she couldn't hear him. Then he turned north and west, back toward the wilderness that had been his home for 1,000 days, back toward the cave and the territories he'd mapped, back toward the life he understood. The journey took longer this time because he wasn't running anymore, wasn't desperate, wasn't driven by immediate need. He took his time, moved carefully, avoided people and towns, lived off the land the way he'd learned to do. When he finally reached the forest boundaries and stepped back into the familiar green darkness, William felt something inside him settle and calm. This was right. This was where he belonged. He made his way through the wilderness using landmarks he remembered, following trails he'd walked 100 times before, moving toward the cave with growing anticipation and growing fear. What if Shadow was gone? What if the wolf had died while William was away? What if he was truly alone now? The cave looked exactly as he'd left it almost 2 months ago. His calendar was still on the wall, his drawings unchanged, his sleeping platform undisturbed. But Shadow wasn't there. William called out, the strange sound echoing through the chambers, but no wolf appeared. He spent that first night alone, listening to the forest sounds and trying not to despair. On the second day, he went hunting, checking his old trap sites and fishing spots, falling back into the rhythms of survival as if he'd never left. On the third day, near sunset, he was cleaning fish by the stream when he felt eyes on him. He turned slowly, hardly daring to hope, and there was Shadow. The wolf was thinner than before, grayer around the muzzle, moving with the stiffness of age, but alive. Those yellow eyes found William's and held, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then William was running, dropping the fish, crossing the distance between them, falling to his knees in front of the wolf. Shadow's tail wagged once, then the wolf pressed forward, pushing his massive head against William's chest. William wrapped his arms around Shadow and cried, relief and joy and grief all mixed together, and the wolf simply stood there and accepted it, providing the comfort that only animals can provide, judgment-free and unconditional. They returned to the cave together, and that night William cooked fish over the fire while Shadow dozed nearby, and everything felt right in a way it hadn't felt since William had left. This was home. The cave, the forest, the wolf. This was where William Robinson belonged. Not in Colombia with people who tried to be kind but couldn't understand. Not in Jasper County, where his past would always haunt him. Here in the wilderness, where his only judge was his own conscience and his only companion was a wolf who knew exactly what he was and didn't care. William opened the journal Esther had given him and began to write. He wrote about that morning 3 years ago when everything changed. He wrote about running into the forest and learning to survive. He wrote about Shadow and the cave and the 1,000 days of penance. He wrote about his journey to find his mother and the grief of arriving too late. He wrote about Esther and the grave and the decision to return to the wilderness. He wrote until his hand cramped and his eyes burned, until his story was down on paper in words that might last longer than memory. Over the following months, William built a real life in the forest. Not just survival, but actual living. He expanded the cave, creating different areas for different purposes. A cooking area with proper ventilation, a storage area that stayed cool year-round, a workshop where he could craft tools and repairs. He established multiple trap lines and fishing spots, rotating through them to avoid depleting any single area. He planted a small garden near the cave entrance with seeds he'd brought from Colombia, growing vegetables that supplemented his diet of fish and game. He continued exploring the wilderness, mapping territories that extended for miles in every direction. He found other caves, other rivers, other resources. He established emergency shelters in various locations, places he could retreat to if the main cave ever became compromised. He was building not just a home, but a kingdom, a territory where he was master and servant both, answerable only to the natural laws of survival. Shadow aged visibly during this time, moving slower each month, sleeping more, hunting less. William took over more of the hunting responsibilities, making sure the old wolf was fed and comfortable. He knew Shadow's time was limited, knew he would have to face that loss eventually, but he pushed the thought away and focused on the present. They still sat together by the fire every evening. They still shared meals. They still communicated in that wordless language they'd developed over years of companionship. William also continued writing in his journal. He wrote about his daily activities, but also about deeper things. His thoughts on guilt and redemption. His understanding of what it meant to kill someone even accidentally. His evolving sense of who he was and what his life meant. He wrote letters to his mother that she would never read, telling her about his life in the wilderness, telling her he was okay, telling her he'd found a kind of peace, even if it wasn't the peace she'd wanted for him. On the anniversary of his return to the forest, 1 year after he'd come back from Colombia, William added new drawings to the cave wall. He drew his mother's grave marker. He drew Esther's cabin. He drew the journey he'd taken and the sorrow he'd found. And he drew one more thing, himself and Shadow, sitting together by the fire, two survivors who had found each other in the wilderness and built something that looked like family. The winters were easier now that William had experience and resources. The summers were productive. Spring and fall brought abundance. The years began to blur together, marked not by calendars, but by the changing seasons and the rhythms of the forest. William stopped counting days. There was no more penance to serve, no arbitrary deadline to meet. He was simply living, day by day, as best he could. Shadow died on a spring morning 3 years after William's return to the forest. The wolf had been declining for months, eating less, moving less, spending most of his time sleeping in his den. William had known it was coming but wasn't prepared for the reality. He woke that morning to find Shadow lying still in the back chamber, eyes closed, chest unmoving. The wolf had died peacefully in his sleep, in the place he'd claimed as home, with his pack nearby. William buried Shadow on a hillside overlooking the stream where they'd first met, in a spot where the sun came through the trees and wildflowers grew. He marked the grave with stones and carved Shadow's name into a piece of oak. Then he sat by the grave for 3 days, not eating, not sleeping, just sitting and remembering and grieving. Shadow had been more than a pet, more than a companion. The wolf had been family, pack, the living embodiment of survival and loyalty and unconditional acceptance. When William finally returned to the cave, it felt empty in a way it never had before. He almost left, almost abandoned the life he'd built and went back to Colombia or somewhere else, anywhere else. But he stayed, because leaving would dishonor Shadow's memory, would waste the years they'd built together. Instead, he threw himself into work, expanding his garden, improving his tools, exploring new territories, writing in his journal. He was 21 years old and completely alone. No family, no friends, no connection to the human world. Just him and the forest and the memories of everyone he'd loved and lost. Some days the loneliness was crushing. Other days it felt like freedom. Most days it was somewhere in between, bearable but not comfortable, sustainable but not satisfying. William began ranging farther from the cave on his explorations, sometimes gone for weeks at a time. He found other isolated homesteads where free black folks and poor whites were carving out lives on land nobody else wanted. He never approached them directly, but he watched from a distance, studying the way they lived, the way they built communities, the way they survived with help from others, instead of in complete isolation. On one of these explorations, about 50 miles from his cave, William found a small settlement that called itself Freedom Town. It was exactly what it sounded like, a community of formerly enslaved people who had purchased land together and were building something new. They had farms and a church and a school. They had children running through the streets and old folks sitting on porches. They had life. William watched Freedom Town for 3 days from the forest edge, seeing something he hadn't seen in years. Black people living without fear, building without permission, existing without apology. It stirred something inside him that he'd thought was dead. Not quite hope, but something adjacent to it. Possibility, maybe. The sense that there might be another way to live beyond isolation. He didn't approach Freedom Town on that trip, or the next several trips over the following months. But he kept returning, kept watching, kept seeing what life looked like when you weren't completely alone. He started wondering if maybe someday he could be part of something like that. Not now, not yet, but eventually, when he was ready, when enough time had passed that he could trust himself around people again. William was 23 when he finally walked into Freedom Town in daylight, no longer hiding in the forest edge but approaching openly. People stared at the wild-looking stranger with long, matted hair and homemade clothes, but they didn't immediately chase him away. An older man, who seemed to be a community leader, approached and asked William what his business was. William told the truth, or a version of it, that he'd been living in the wilderness, that he was alone, that he was looking to see if there might be a place for him here. The man studied him with shrewd eyes and asked the question William had been dreading. Was he running from something? William met his gaze and said yes, he'd been running, but whatever he'd been running from was 6 years in the past, and nobody was chasing him anymore. The man seemed to accept that answer, or at least accept that William wasn't an immediate threat. He told William that Freedom Town welcomed people who were willing to work and contribute, who respected others and followed the community rules. They didn't ask too many questions about the past, because everyone there had a past they'd rather leave behind. William was given a trial period, 3 months to prove he could live among people again, could follow rules, could be part of something bigger than himself. They gave him a small cabin at the edge of town, barely more than a shack, but it had 4 walls and a roof and a door that locked. William moved in with the few possessions he'd brought from the cave, including his journal and the money his mother had saved for him, which he'd never spent. The transition from wilderness to community was harder than William had anticipated. After years of silence, the constant noise of people talking and children playing and normal life happening was overwhelming. After years of complete freedom, having to follow schedules and social norms felt constraining. After years of answering to no one, being part of a community that had expectations felt suffocating. But he persevered. He worked in the communal fields during planting and harvest. He helped build new cabins for families moving to Freedom Town. He used the skills he'd learned in the wilderness, tracking, hunting, finding water, reading weather, to help the community in ways they hadn't expected. He was quiet and strange, and people whispered about him, but he was also useful and reliable, and gradually, grudgingly accepted. William never told anyone the complete truth about his past. He said he'd been in the wilderness for years, which was true. He said his mother had died, which was true. He said he'd had to leave his home because of trouble, which was true enough. People filled in the blanks with their own assumptions. Maybe he'd escaped slavery, maybe he'd run from debt, maybe he'd committed some minor crime, and William let them believe whatever they wanted. He kept writing in his journal, now documenting his reintegration into human society, the challenges and small victories, the ways he was changing and the ways he couldn't change. He wrote about missing shadow, missing the cave, missing the simplicity of wilderness life, where the only rules were survival and the only judgment came from nature. But he also wrote about the benefits of community, shared meals, shared labor, shared protection, shared joy. On the 6-month anniversary of his arrival in Freedom Town, the community held a meeting to decide if William could stay permanently. He stood before 30 people and answered their questions honestly. Yes, he preferred solitude to crowds. Yes, he sometimes disappeared into the forest for days at a time. Yes, he had a past he didn't want to discuss. But he also worked hard, contributed to the community, caused no trouble, and wanted to build a life here if they'd let him. The vote was split, but ultimately in his favor. William Robinson was accepted as a permanent resident of Freedom Town, with the understanding that he would continue to contribute and respect the community rules. He agreed, feeling something shift inside him. Not happiness exactly, but relief. Relief that he wasn't completely alone anymore. Relief that he'd found a place that might become home. Relief that maybe, just maybe, his mother's sacrifice hadn't been for nothing. William lived in Freedom Town for the rest of his life, though he never completely abandoned the wilderness. He kept the cave maintained, visiting it several times a year, treating it as a refuge when the human world became too much. He taught young people in the community how to hunt and fish and survive in the forest. He became known as a quiet, competent man who kept to himself, but could be counted on in a crisis. He never married, never had children, never built the kind of family his mother might have wanted for him. But he had something else, a community that accepted him, a purpose that went beyond mere survival, a life that honored both the boy who'd fled into the forest and the man he'd become. He kept his journal, adding to it regularly, creating a record of his extraordinary life that he hoped might someday help someone else who felt lost and alone and unsure if they could survive what life had thrown at them. William Robinson died at age 67, having lived 55 years beyond that terrible morning when he'd pushed Thomas Thornfield Jr. He died peacefully in his cabin in Freedom Town, surrounded by people who'd known him for decades, but still called him the Forest Man because of where he'd come from. His journal was found among his possessions, hundreds of pages of careful writing documenting his journey from frightened boy to wilderness survivor to community member. The journal was passed down through generations of Freedom Town residents, becoming a treasured artifact and a reminder that survival was possible even when everything seemed lost. William's story became legend. The boy who lived alone in the wilderness for years with only a wolf for company, who survived guilt and grief and isolation, who found his way back to humanity without losing the wildness that had saved him. On William's grave marker, carved by the same community that had accepted him 44 years earlier, were simple words that captured the essence of his extraordinary life. William Robinson, 1867-1934, survivor of the wilderness, child of the forest, brother to all who knew him. And beneath that, one more line that he'd written in his journal and requested be added to his stone. I survived 1,000 days alone,